Arguably, of all the branches of the German armed forces in World War II, only one, the Kriegsmarine, or Navy, had the ability to bring Britain to defeat once the immediate threat of invasion after Dunkirk had receded. Whether it was the U-boats in the Atlantic or the great capital ships, such as Bismarck or Tirpitz in the North Atlantic, the Kriegsmarine had the ability, through its attacks on the all-important convoy system, to starve Britain into submission. However, of all the Axis forces of the period, the Kriegsmarine is perhaps the least known. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was only allowed a minimal navy of 15,000 personnel, 6 capital ships of no more than 10,000 tons, 6 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and no submarines. However, even before the Nazi takeover, German naval rearmament had begun with the launching of the first pocket battleship, Deutschland, in 1931. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Hitler soon began to ignore many of the treaty restrictions and accelerated German rearmament. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 18 June 1935 allowed Germany to build a navy equivalent to 35% of British surface ship tonnage and 45% of British submarine tonnage. Any battleships were to be limited to no more than 35,000 tons. That same year, the Reichsmarine was renamed as the Kriegsmarine. The first military action of the Kriegsmarine came during the Spanish Civil War, when German ships, along with British, French, and Italian naval forces, patrolled the coasts of Spain in order to enforce the international arms embargo. The German ships patrolled a section of the Mediterranean coast between Almeria and Valencia. In reality, though, the German presence was used to provide support for Franco's nationalists. In response, the pocket battleship Deutschland was bombed and damaged on 29 May 1937 by Spanish Republican forces at Avisa. Germans retaliated and shelled Republican coastal positions. Later, following the 1938 crisis of German demands on Czechoslovakia, Germany abandoned all pretensions of adherence to treaty limitations on its navy. In the mid-1930s, a major discussion about a new fleet program started in Germany. There were two major opinions as to what kind of program should be chosen. One plan focused on a large submarine fleet and a relatively small surface fleet for coastal protection. This plan was preferred by the U-boat faction in the Kriegsmarine Command. The other alternative was a mixed fleet of various surface ships and a much smaller U-boat fleet. This was quite similar to the German Imperial Navy in World War I or the British Royal Navy. In the end, this plan was chosen as the new fleet building program. After several modifications, it was called the Z Plan. According to this plan, the German Kriegsmarine would grow to about 800 units. These would consist of 13 battleships and battlecruisers, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 Panzerschiff, 23 cruisers, and 22 so-called Spackkreuzer, which were basically large destroyers. In addition to this, many smaller vessels would be built. Those ships would be built between 1939 and 1946. In this time, the personnel of the Kriegsmarine would enlarge to 201,000 men, and over 33 billion Reichsmark would be spent for building the new units. This project never really began. The realization of the Z Plan started on January 29, 1939, when 2 H-class battleship keels were laid down. 3 months later, Germany quit the fleet treaty with England, and the dream of no more war against Britain was gone. Only 4 months later, Germany attacked Poland. With expectations in Germany of a quick victory by land, work on all Z-Plan projects was stopped. During the next months, all incomplete ships of the Z-Plan were scrapped, and the material was used to build additional submarines. In May 1940, cut off from its former continental allies, Britain depended more and more upon its dominions and empire, and increasingly upon the United States. Above all, it was essential to her survival to guard the Atlantic and Mediterranean lifelines. If either of them were cut, the consequences might be fatal.
I named the ship King George V. May God bless her and those who serve in her.
Years ago, Britain launched her last battleship, the Rodney. Hopefully, we thought she might be the last we should ever need to launch. We had dreams of building a new and better world, a world that would never again know the tramp of armies and the clash of war. Today, those dreams lie shattered, but one truth remains. A mighty British Navy is still the best guarantee, not only of the safety of our own people, but of the peace of all the world. The King George V and the greater ships that are to come after her represent the new spirit of Britain, to lead all nations in strength and determination for peace.
In the beginning, the combined British and French navies had unchallenged superiority over the German Navy. Had Grand Admiral Erich Raeder been given the time and freedom to do as he envisioned under the Z Plan, the rebuilt Kriegsmarine would have presented a serious threat to the supremacy of the Royal Navy from the first day of the war. As it happened, the war came far too soon for Raeder, who found his force under-equipped for such a task. Before the war, the commander of the German U-boats, Karl Dönitz, calculated that he would need 300 of the latest Atlantic boats operating in a system known as wolf packs. In these wolf packs, the U-boats would attack a convoy simultaneously and overwhelm the defending warships. This would create havoc among the merchant ships. This strategy, over time, would knock the island nation out of the war. The reality was that on 1 September 1939, the German U-boat fleet consisted of 57 boats available for action. These were mostly the small, short-range Type II U-boats, which were useful primarily for mine-laying and operations in British coastal waters. The German surface fleet was no better off. The Germans were outnumbered 10-1 by the Royal Navy. In 1939, the Kriegsmarine lacked the strength to challenge the Allies in a fleet engagement for command of the sea. Instead, German naval strategy relied on commerce raiding, using capital ships, armed merchant cruisers, submarines, and aircraft. Many German warships were already at sea when war was declared. These included most of the available U-boats and the pocket battleships Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee, which had sailed out into the Atlantic in August. These ships began an immediate assault on British and French shipping. A U-boat, U-30, sank the liner SS Athenia within hours of the declaration of war. This was in breach of her orders not to sink passenger ships. 112 passengers lost their lives in the sinking, including 28 American citizens. The Royal Navy quickly introduced a convoy system for the protection of trade that gradually extended out from the British Isles, eventually reaching as far as Panama, Bombay, and Singapore. The convoy system allowed the Royal Navy to concentrate its escorts near the one place the U-boats were guaranteed to be found: the convoys. But some British naval officers, and particularly the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sought a more offensive strategy. The Royal Navy formed anti-submarine hunting groups based on aircraft carriers to patrol the shipping lanes in the western approaches and hunt for German U-boats. But this strategy was deeply flawed, because a U-boat, with its tiny silhouette, was always likely to spot the surface warships and submerge long before it was itself sighted by them. The carrier aircraft were little help. Although they could spot submarines on the surface, at this stage of the war they had no adequate weapons to attack them. Any submarine found by an aircraft was long gone by the time surface warships arrived. The hunting group strategy proved a disaster within days. On 14 September 1939, Britain's most modern carrier, the Ark Royal, narrowly avoided being sunk when 3 torpedoes from U-39 exploded prematurely. The U-39 was promptly sunk by the escorting destroyers, becoming the first U-boat loss of the war. Failing to learn the lesson, another carrier, the Courageous, was sunk 3 days later by U-29. Escort destroyers hunting for U-boats continued to be a prominent but misguided feature of British anti-submarine strategy for the first year of the war. The U-boats nearly always proved elusive, and the convoys, denuded of cover, were put at even greater risk. German success in sinking the Courageous was surpassed a month later when U-boat commander Günter Prien in U-47 penetrated the British naval anchorage at Scapa Flow and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak. Prien immediately became a war hero in Germany. In the South Atlantic, British forces were stretched by the cruise of the raider Admiral Graf Spee, which sank 9 merchant ships of 50,000 tons in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans during the first 3 months of war. The British and French formed a series of hunting groups, including 3 battle cruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, and 15 cruisers to seek the raider and her sister Deutschland. These hunting groups scoured the oceans for months with no success until one British admiral played a hunch. The day before war was declared, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appointed Winston Churchill to be First Lord of the Admiralty. 25 years earlier, Churchill had the same job and had prepared the British Navy to fight in World War I. The day he was appointed, the Navy sent out a message to all of its ships: Winston is back. Churchill understood how important sea power was to the survival of his country. Although submarines were the greatest danger to British shipping, they were not the only danger. Germany had 2 big battle cruisers ready for combat, along with 3 pocket battleships and 2 heavy cruisers. All of them were newer, faster, and more powerful than any British heavy cruiser. When it became apparent that war was imminent, Grand Admiral Raeder sent out a number of his submarines to wait on the North Atlantic sea lanes. He also ordered the pocket battleships, Graf Spee and Deutschland, to cruise the South Atlantic. They would be far away from the regular sea lanes and cruise with secretly dispatched tankers and supply ships. Technologically, Admiral Graf Spee was ahead of her time, especially in terms of her speed. Some theorized at the time that 2 such ships must have existed, which would explain a rapid series of sightings in distant locations. After commissioning in 1936, Admiral Graf Spee served as fleet flagship until 1938 and performed international maritime control duties off the coast of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Late in September 1939, Captain Hans Langsdorff was ordered to move into the main shipping track between Pernambuco, Brazil, and Cape Town, South Africa. From September through December 1939, Admiral Graf Spee sank 9 merchant ships in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. The first victim was within hours of receiving his orders. Longsdorff strictly adhered to the rules of mercantile warfare at the time and saved all of the crew members of these ships. Not a single life was lost in their sinkings. The captured crews were transferred to the tanker Altmark. Later, these 303 crew members were freed by force in neutral Norwegian territorial waters by the British destroyer HMS Cossack. The Royal Navy quickly assembled forces to search for the surface raider. Force G, the South American cruiser squadron, comprised the heavy cruiser HMS Exeter and two Leander-class light cruisers, the HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles. The force was commanded by Commodore Henry Harwood. Harwood had been studying his ocean charts and marking the position of each victim of the Graf Spee, and noticed a pattern. Harwood suspected that the raider would try to strike next at the crowded merchant shipping lanes off the River Plate estuary between Uruguay and Argentina. The three cruisers stationed themselves off the estuary on 12 December and waited. At dawn on 13 December, British lookouts sighted smoke to the northeast. It was the German pocket battleship, less than 20 miles away. Harwood's hunch was right. Longsdorff saw the British ships almost as soon as they saw him, and he headed for them immediately. Despite having correctly identified Exeter, Longsdorff initially suspected that the two light cruisers were smaller destroyers. He thought that the British ships were protecting a merchant convoy, the destruction of which would be a major prize. At more than 16 miles, the Graf Spee opened fire with her 6 11-inch guns. The shells burst just short of Exeter, abreast the middle of the ship. Splinters from these shells killed the torpedo tube crews, damaged the ship's communications, and riddled the funnels and searchlights. 3 minutes later, at extreme range, Exeter began to return fire. Achilles fired 1 minute after that, and Ajax 7 minutes after the first British round was fired. The first major sea battle of World War II had begun. Longsdorff was a brave and skillful sea captain, but he had made a serious mistake. He had underestimated the courage, skill, and determination of his enemies. He should have stayed at long distance out of range of the British guns and hammered them. Instead, he rushed in to make a quick kill. As it moved in for the attack, the Graf Spee's 11-inch guns began to score hits. Exeter suffered a direct hit, which struck her B turret, putting it and its two guns out of action. Shrapnel swept the bridge, killing or wounding all bridge personnel except the captain and 2 others. Captain Bell's communications were wrecked. Communications from the aft conning position were also destroyed. For the rest of the battle, the ship had to be steered via a chain of messengers. Meanwhile, Ajax and Achilles had closed and started firing all guns, smashing shells into Graf Spee. The Graf Spee began taking as much punishment as she was dishing out. Then Longsdorff saw the Exeter turn back into the fight. Exeter fired 2 torpedoes from her starboard tubes, but both missed. Exeter then turned so that she could fire her port torpedoes, but received 2 more direct hits from 11-inch shells. One hit a turret and put it out of action. The other entered the hull and started fires. At 0640, an 11-inch shell burst just short of Achilles, in line with the bridge, damaging her and causing a few casualties. However, gunnery continued from the secondary control position. At about this time, Graf Spee turned to the west under the cover of a smokescreen. The light cruisers were now doing about 31 knots, having worked up to that speed from 14 knots initially. At 0656, almost 30 minutes into the fight, Ajax and Achilles turned to starboard to bring all their guns to bear on Graf Spee. The heavy fire forced Longsdorff to turn away and lay a smokescreen. At 0710, the two light cruisers turned to reduce the range from 8 miles, even though this meant only their forward guns could fire. At 0716, Admiral Graf Spee turned and fired her 11-inch guns at Ajax and Achilles, who turned to starboard to bring all their guns to bear. At 0725, Ajax was hit by an 11-inch shell that put X turret out of action and jammed Y turret. At 0730, Exeter's remaining turret was put out of action. Severely damaged, unable to fire and keep up with the action, Exeter broke off the engagement and steamed slowly toward the Falklands. By 0740, Ajax and Achilles were running low on ammunition, and the British decided to change tactics. Harwood decided to shadow Graf Spee, which was moving westward. He wanted to wait until night to move in, when he could attack with torpedoes. This would also allow him to better utilize his advantage of speed while minimizing his deficiencies in armor. The battle now turned into a pursuit. Longsdorff was no coward, but he knew that there was no German base where he could get repairs. If the fight kept on the way it was going, he believed he could sink the 3 British ships, but his vessel would be so badly damaged that he would be overwhelmed by the next enemy ship he encountered. Since the River Plate estuary had sandbanks that divided it, Harwood ordered Achilles to shadow Admiral Graf Spee. Ajax would cover any attempt by the German battleship to double back through a different channel. At 2048, silhouetted against the setting sun, the Graf Spee entered the River Plate. Achilles once again closed the range, and Graf Spee opened fire. When Achilles turned away, the last round had been fired. During the battle, a total of 108 men had been killed on the two sides, including 36 on Admiral Graf Spee. The Graf Spee entered Montevideo in neutral Uruguay and dropped anchor at about 0010 on the 14th of December. Under international law, a ship at war could not stay in a neutral port for more than 3 days and could not be permitted to receive help from a neutral dockyard. If the Graf Spee should leave port again, the damaged Ajax and Achilles were the only Commonwealth warships in the area. The British now made an effort to buy time. They did this by feeding false intelligence to the Germans that an overwhelming British force was being assembled. This was in hope that Longsdorff would delay his departure. The Germans bought the deception. The Graf Spee had also used 2/3 of her 11-inch ammunition and only had enough left for approximately 20 minutes of firing. This was hardly enough to fight her way out of Montevideo, let alone get back to Germany. While intense negotiations were undertaken, Captain Longsdorff consulted with his command in Germany. He received orders that permitted various options, but not internment in Uruguay. Early in the evening of 16 December, just before sunset, the Graf Spee started to move slowly out of Montevideo. British lookouts sent the radio flash, "She's coming out." Suddenly, at the harbor entrance, there was a great explosion on the Graf Spee. Longsdorff had blown up his own ship. Before leaving the harbor, he had put all of his crew, save a few men, on a German merchant ship in the harbor. As the pocket battleship sank to the bottom, Longsdorff and the remaining men on her got into lifeboats and returned to Montevideo. He had decided against renewing the fight because he could not bear to lose more men in a hopeless fight. 3 days later, Longsdorff shot himself. He was buried in Montevideo with full military honors, and several British officers attended. For the first half of 1940, there were no German surface raiders in the Atlantic because the German fleet had been concentrated for the invasion of Norway. The invasion of Norway began in April 1940. It was a disaster for the Kriegsmarine. The Germans lost the heavy cruiser Blücher at Oslo and 10 destroyers which would be needed for the invasion of England. The Kriegsmarine did, however, sink a number of British ships, including the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. The losses in the Norway campaign meant that only a handful of heavy ships were ready for action for the planned, but never executed, invasion of Britain, called Operation Sea Lion in the summer of 1940. After the fall of France and the conquest of Norway, the German submarine fleet was brought much closer to the British shipping lanes in the Atlantic. At first, the British merchant convoys lacked radar-equipped escorts. This made the submarines very hard to detect during their nighttime surface attacks. Also, this year was one of the most successful as measured in terms of merchant shipping sunk compared to submarines lost. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the Battle of the Mediterranean began. Some 62 German submarines were transferred there, sneaking past the British naval base at Gibraltar. The Mediterranean submarines sunk 24 major Allied warships, including 12 destroyers, 4 cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, and 1 battleship. They also sank 94 merchant ships for a total of 449,206 tons of shipping. None of the Mediterranean submarines made it back to their home bases. They were all either sunk in battle or scuttled by their crews at the end of the war. Starting in the summer of 1940, a small but steady stream of warships and armed merchant raiders set sail from Germany for the Atlantic. The power of a battleship against a convoy was demonstrated by the fate of convoy HX-84, which was found by the German pocket battleship Admiral Scheer on 5 November 1940. The Admiral Scheer quickly sank 5 ships and damaged several others as the convoy scattered. Only the sacrifice of the escorting armed merchant cruiser HMS Jervis Bay and failing light allowed the rest of the convoy to escape. In January 1941, the formidable German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which were more powerful than any Allied ship that could catch them, put to sea from Germany to raid the shipping lanes in Operation Berlin. The cruiser Admiral Hipper, on 12 February 1941, found the unescorted convoy SLS-64, consisting of 19 ships, and sank 7 of them. With so many German raiders at large in the Atlantic, the British were forced to provide battleship escorts to as many convoys as possible. In May, the Germans mounted the most ambitious raid of all, Operation Rheinübung, or Rhine Exercise. The British Navy was about to face its most deadly challenge.
The largest battleship ever built in Germany is launched by the leader of the Third Reich and named after the founder of the Second Reich. She's christened by the granddaughter of Bismarck, who was the right-hand man of Kaiser Wilhelm, and 35,000 tons of glistening steel for the defense of Germany. Hesitates for a couple of moments, and then moves down to the water.
Wir konnten nicht los und getan. herzlich unserem Hoffen. Oh, herzlich unserem Hoffen.
The new battleship Bismarck and the cruiser Prinz Eugen put to sea to attack the convoys. On 21 May, the German ships arrived at the Grimstadfjord in Norway, where their camouflage painting was removed, and Prinz Eugen was refueled. The Bismarck did not refuel its tanks, a decision that proved to be an essential error for later operations. Unknown to the Germans, they had been photographed by a British reconnaissance Spitfire. This gave the British the exact location of the German ships. That evening, the German ships left the fjord and headed north. The weather got worse hour by hour. Dusk came and low clouds prevented the ships from detection from the air. Heading north, then northwest, the German fleet made good and largely uneventful progress across the Norwegian Sea toward Greenland. On the evening of 23 May, the Bismarck force was detected by the radar-equipped heavy cruisers HMS Suffolk and Norfolk. They had been patrolling the Denmark Strait in expectation of a German breakout. The rival ships exchanged fire, but the heavily outgunned British cruisers sensibly retired to a safe range and shadowed the enemy while their own heavy units drew closer. At approximately 05:30 on Saturday, 24 May, as the German squadron was about to leave the Denmark Strait, Prinz Eugen's hydrophones detected the presence of two additional ships some distance to port. By 05:45, both were in sight, although the German fleet had not yet identified the enemy force. It was a British battle group comprised of the new battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Hood, which were under the command of Rear Admiral Lancelot Holland. Prince of Wales had only recently been completed and was still being worked up. Indeed, she sailed to meet Bismarck with dockyard workmen still on board, completing her fitting out. Hood had been built as a fast battle cruiser and modified to give her protection more like a battleship, but she still had relatively weak deck armor. It was not unexpected by the Germans that they would be detected by other British ships. However, being detected by capital ships was a nasty surprise. At 05:49, after moving into position, Holland ordered fire to be concentrated on the leading German ship, Prinz Eugen, believing it to be the Bismarck. Fortunately for the British, the captain of the Prince of Wales soon realized the error and changed his target. Holland amended his order to fire on the correct ship, but this did not reach Hood's gunnery control before the first salvo was fired. Hood fired first at 05:52 in daylight, followed very soon afterward by Prince of Wales. The range to the German ships was about 12.5 miles. More than 2 minutes went by as Admiral Lutyens, in command of the Bismarck battle group, hesitated to respond. Captain Lindemann took the initiative and ordered fire to be returned on the lead British ship, the Hood. The Germans had identified the British ships and made a turn toward them. Both Bismarck and Prinz Eugen opened fire on the Hood at a range of 11 miles. The early gunfire from the German ships was very accurate, and within 2 minutes the Hood had been hit with an 8-inch shell from the Prinz Eugen. It struck the British ship near the mainmast and caused a huge fire, which the Hood's crew tried to bring under control. However, the Prince of Wales had also hit Bismarck, causing a fuel leak from the forward tanks. Lutyens ordered his cruiser to switch its main guns toward the Prince of Wales, which his secondary guns were now targeting. At 0600, Hood, which was about to turn to port to bring her full weight of armament to bear on Bismarck, was hit amidships by at least one shell from Bismarck. This was at a distance of under 9 miles. Very shortly afterward, observers on both sides saw a huge jet of flame race skyward, followed by a rumbling explosion that split the huge ship in two. Splinters rained down on Prince of Wales, which was half a mile away. The Hood's stern rose first, and then sank shortly before the bow. This happened all within 3 minutes. Admiral Holland and 1,415 crewmen went down with the ship. Prince of Wales had to turn toward the German fleet in order to avoid hitting the wreckage left by the flagship, and was hit hard a number of times, losing several crew on the compass platform. Still, the Prince of Wales gunfire had caused damage to the Bismarck. The British battleship turned away, laying smoke, with the aft turret firing briefly under local control. Although Captain Lindemann wanted to chase the Prince of Wales and finish her off, Admiral Lütjens ignored his suggestion. The delay could risk the possibility of encountering more warships, and was not his main task of convoy destruction. Incredibly, in a battle lasting less than 20 minutes, Bismarck, with the Prinzjugend, fighting ships far larger, had destroyed one capital ship and forced another to turn away. This was something almost unknown in the history of the Royal Navy. Despite the jubilation on board the Bismarck, the battleship was not safe. The British knew her position, her forward radar was out of action, and she had been hit 3 times. One of those hits caused water to leak into the fuel storage and contaminated it. Lütjens decided that he would have to head to the French coast and the dry docks at Saint-Nazaire for repairs. The British continued to shadow the Bismarck after the Prince of Wales rendezvoused with Norfolk and Suffolk. At one stage, Bismarck turned briefly on her pursuers in order to give Prinzjugend the opportunity to detach and escape with the message, "Good hunting." Determined to avenge the sinking of Hood, the British committed every possible unit to hunting down Bismarck. During the evening of 24 May, an attack was made by a small group of Swordfish torpedo planes from the 825th Naval Air Squadron of the aircraft carrier Victorious. One hit was scored, but caused only superficial damage to Bismarck's armored belt. All hopes for the British were now pinned on Force H, whose main units were the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the old battlecruiser Renown, and the cruiser Sheffield. This battle group, commanded by Admiral James Somerville, had been diverted north from Gibraltar. At dusk that evening, and in atrocious weather conditions, Swordfish from Ark Royal launched an attack. The first wave mistakenly targeted the Sheffield, which was now shadowing the quarry. Although precious time was lost by this incident, it proved beneficial to the British. It was found that the magnetic detonators on the torpedoes used against the Sheffield were defective. For the next attack on the Bismarck, they were replaced by those designed to explode on contact. In a final attack that occurred in darkness at around 2100, a miracle hit by a single torpedo jammed Bismarck's rudder and steering gear. This rendered her virtually unable to maneuver. She was able to steam only in a large circle. This took her in the direction of King George V and Rodney, two